science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker to advance the frontier of architectural thinking. And today, yet once again, I think I have an interesting conversation with you with none other than Sunil Khilnani, the fantastic historian and well-published author who was, of course, on the panel discussion that we heard in a few weeks ago. But today, he and I have a one-on-one conversation. We discuss the idea of India, the Nehruvian legacy, and the contemporary role of rethinking modernism for India. This is an extremely important topic in the face of rising neo-nationalism. And it indicates the opening of an area of thinking which I hope to be working on and be more active in the coming years. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Please do let me know if there's something that strikes you or if you have any comments. Always send me an email. I'm happy to respond. Here we go.
Welcome to Architecture Talk, Sunil. I'm so glad to have this opportunity to have in a sense, follow-up conversation following up our great panel discussion on the question of the relevance of mid-century Indian modernism today. And as I noted in that panel, your book, amongst your many books, of course, The Idea of India is now iconic, widely cited, quoted, held up, badgered by prime ministers down to academics. And I pulled up my old copy, and I see here rupees 324 I paid for it. good price, I think. Those days on the some must be Chandigarh railway station or something where I was like, oh my God, look at this great new book. So thanks for the great work in it that you have done. And one of the amazing things about reading the book, of course, you're a historian, is I have, and I reread it just last few days. I get a sense, somehow you have an interest in architecture. You seem to refer again and again to the colonial buildings, to the Indo-Saracenic, which I don't think you like too much, and then modern architecture, and your descriptions of the architecture also had a certain, I would say, familiarity with the architecture as a genre. Am I reading too much into this, or do you have some connection with architecture?
No, I think you're right. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me on your series. I'm aware that this is very much an architecture focused series, and as you're suggesting, I'm coming to an interest in architecture from a somewhat oblique angle, partly as a historian, but above all, really is from a personal interest. I'm very interested in architecture in general, in what's happening, and in the history of architecture. And I guess, as a historian, it seems to me, particularly in a culture like India's, where literacy has been such a sort of restricted and narrow base of the population, that architecture is a way of making physically present and visible a variety of different ideas, whether it's ideas about power, ideas about the sort of cultural substance of a society, ideas about hierarchy, the order and control of a society, and sometimes even conflict. And so it seems to me, particularly in thinking about the history of India, where texts only give us some access to what's going on. The sort of built environment is a form of text. So there's a way in which I'm very interested in how it gets written at different moments, and how
Yeah.
it gets read at different moments, and the attempt to rewrite and to reread as we've seen over time. So in a way, that's the kind of historical interest. But there's also personally a great interest. I mean, I once fantasized that I would I wanted to be an architect at one point. Build little models of buildings and so on. But thankfully, the profession and the world was spared that enthusiasm of mine.
All right. Well, no, thank you. And this is even better because now you have a certain taste for architecture, but it's very nice to see how you weave that into your historical and intellectual, interpretive narratives. And you're so right. I mean, when we think of in a sense, the establishment of monumental architecture in India, the stupas with the great Puranas were actually billboards, essentially, in one sense, weren't they? They were scrolls laid out, and the idea saying, okay, here is the sutra, and we are going to actually make a building out of sutras, right?
Absolutely. As you say, they were literally billboards. I mean, the Buddha's great skill was to turn abstract ideas into symbols. The symbol of the chakra, of the wheel, of these different. So in that one symbol expressed in stone on a building, you got a sense of the philosophy or the abstract ideas. And I think that's exactly right. So that this was both in the monumental buildings, but it also translated into the kind of imagery, which then often referred to the sort of architectural statements of those symbols, but then picked up on that imagery and wove it into everyday life. So I think there was a way in which, architecture, monumental, also then became part of the intimate everyday life and world of people.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, for instance, your standard Hindu post-Gupta temple, is also simultaneously a very intimate space of darshan, but at the same time, it weaves and narrates a cosmic order in its shikhara and tries to connect a very profound intimacy with the infinite cosmos, if you like.
And it's also an instrument of the hierarchical control of the society.
Of course.
That who gets to have the darshan,
and who gets to
be
in
which of the spaces.
And who controls the threshold and who controls the everything. So it's all. So individual, society, hierarchy, and the cosmic all woven together into a kind of a fantastic tapestry. I always think of Tere Ghar Ke Samne. You remember Devanand's film in which he's an architect with Nutan, I think, isn't it? Yeah.
Right.
And she has, there's the famous song in the Qutub Minar, them going down the Qutub Minar. But there's a scene in the movie in which he gets on his lambretta. And I think Nutan has abdicated to Shimla or something. I don't know what it is, but he's chasing after her. And so he's going from Delhi to Shimla, but he's on his lambretta. But then, of course, he's an architect, so he has to go through the Capitol complex. He rides his lambretta
very stylish, yes,
very stylishly in his very particular mode. But I just think of that at the moment. I think that film is from the late 50s, early 60s, and in this unfolding theater, if you like, of architecture in the Indian political, cultural, social landscape, topography, if you like. You spoke of the Nehruvian engagement of Le Corbusier to build Chandigarh in this very distinct modernist mold at a time when there were a lot of contentions in the Indian social circle about, what the Indian style should be, which was, A, an architectural question, but B, also a political expression question. Was it mostly a gesture towards the world, do you think, from the Nehruvian perspective of saying, here is the new India? Or was it also, you talk about the pouring of the concrete, that Chandigarh was certainly made from concrete, and concrete was this great expression of the modern India. The Nehruvian phrase, the sort of of the temples of modern India. How do you read his recasting? How do you think it fits into this sort of theater of architecture in the social?
Well, I mean, it's part of what was, I think, a very distinctive conception of a kind of Indian national identity in a way that is sort of underway in the early and middle part of the 20th century, which was a conception of India, even though it had come through the experience of and the violence of colonialism and the injury of colonialism, a conception of India which was not a victim and which was not having to kind of define itself by withdrawing or retreating into a kind of nativism. Right. So it's so this is, I think, characteristic of someone like Tagore, but also of someone like Gandhi and of someone like Nehru, who then has to, in a sense, translate some of the ideas and philosophies and moralities of Tagore and Gandhi into a modern state form. So it's this idea that India doesn't to be an Indian or to believe in the Indian nation is not to be a nativist, is not to have to reject what has come from elsewhere. And indeed, on the contrary, it's to start to articulate a kind of alternative universalism. And I think that that's what the kind of ambition was. So, when Tagore or Gandhi, or indeed even Nehru asks, they don't ask, what is it good for an Indian to do? They ask, what is it good for a human being to do? It's a much bigger ambition than many of the other anti-colonial nationalisms that emerge, or indeed any of the nationalisms that emerge in the 20th century. And it's also a form of thinking about one's own culture and civilization, which doesn't see it as perfect, which is self-critical, and doesn't see it as self-sufficient, sees it as needing to learn from others, and even those who may have kind of oppressed one. There are things to be taken and assimilated and learned, and so I think it's this sense of a kind of use of critical reason to articulate a sense of who you are and how you belong in the world. So I think the engagement that Nehru and his colleagues indeed sort of launch after 1947 is to try and realize this stance through a series of choices, series of choices of institutions, choice above all of how the Indian national identity is defined through the Constitution, which is a very distinct form. As you know, there's no national language or religion or culture. It's this strange, what to many at the time looked like an unstable mix of what a nation should be. And I think Chandigarh was part of that expression. So it was a statement both to the world, look, where we can make our choices. If we want to get Corbusier to build for India, we'll get him to come and build. It's a statement also to fellow Indians saying, we need to engage with this kind of modernist abstraction. But it's also part of a series of things that were going on at the time. I mentioned the Constitution, but it was also the creation of, for example, industrial towns like Bhilai, which were these kind of microcosms where they were kind of pan-Indian. You brought people from all parts of the country, and they were engaged in this project of industrialization. But it was also, and you talked about the theater of architecture, and I think that's right, because there was also the performance of these ideas. They had to be performed. So Chandigarh was part of the performance of such an idea. Another way was the Republic Day parades, which was a kind of performance of another aspect of Indian identity, the folkloric, the more somewhat sentimental in some ways, but also the industrial and the modern.
And colonial, that was also.
And exactly. It took place. It was a kind of, reappropriation of the colonial, of the Rajpath, of the Kingsway, as it was known. So I think there was this was all part of Chandigarh has to be seen in the context of these multiple engagements to position India as equal to but different from other nation states.
You use the great phrase, an alternate universalism, right? I mean, and while India was constituted in the legacy of, the United States, France, the sort of nation state experiment, which started whatever, late 18th, early 19th century. This was, you argue, it's a very special kind of an experiment, which is still ongoing. So, I wonder if you talk a little bit more about your thinking about this in the Indian experiment as a kind of an alternate democracy, alternate vision of universalism. So what was that, and in what ways do you think Chandigarh fits into that alternative?
To summarize it somewhat crudely, as I said, I mean, the emergence of India as a nation state committed to democracy was completely historically unexpected and historically not to plan. We know obviously that the British were deeply suspicious and skeptical of that possibility. Many in India were also skeptical of that possibility. And certainly the whole weight of, Western political philosophy and political theory was skeptical of that possibility. How could you make a nation, let alone a democracy, of the kind of material that India was going to be after 1947. And so
the subsequent history of many post-colonial nations has been very different. I mean, India has emerged as a kind of a special case. Please go on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, a lot of that has to do with this complex arrangement of ideas and values in the Constitution. I mean, the Constitution is it's not a perfect document, but it was a pretty remarkable accommodation of a variety of different demands, of the demands of different deeply held religious beliefs, the demands of multiple languages, the demands of regions, and so on, into a kind of compromise, which has actually been remarkably durable. I mean, it's the Indian Constitution has now endured longer than the French Constitution, the present French Constitution, which if you think the Fifth Republic in France begins in 1958, well, the Indian Constitution is 11 years older than the present French Constitution. Right. So what I mean is it's acquired a certain kind of stability, even as it's been abused and weakened and so on. But I think this did describe a form of national identity which was extremely distinctive to India. And of course, it was also one that was a provocation to many Indians, because it was at once establishing a democracy, but it was also at the same time saying a democracy doesn't mean the unchecked rule of the majority. And so, for people who interpret democracy in a rather simple way or simplistic way, that doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, democracy should be the rule of the majority. Actually, no, liberal democracies are more complicated. And that's something that I think the Indian Constitution managed to achieve in a way that, as I say, has been a constant goad and provocation to those who think it's kind of, suppressing a certain kind of what they see as a kind of majority desire.
Nehru's described Chandigarh, and you quoted it as, something that hits you on the head, makes you think, right? I mean, how does our notion fit into what you're describing?
Well, I think that goes back to this moment in the 1950s where there was a real sense that an attempt to kind of revive and kickstart intellectual and public discussion in India. Even much of the politics of that time was kind of explaining ideas to the public, trying to say, well, this is why there was an attempt to engage people in thinking about the direction that India was going in, and a debate about architecture. And part of that, became this debate about what is Indian in Indian architecture. That debate was paralleled in many different fields. What is Indian in the Indian Constitution? As you said, it was drawn from so many different parts of the world. Famously, at the time, people said, of the Indian Constitution, it was said, we wanted the sound of sitar, and yet instead we got a brass band.
Brass band.
But this was all part of what I think was a productive and useful debate. And I think Chandigarh, in that sense, was sort of saying, look, we're going to build something that it doesn't have a colonial dimension to it. It doesn't have a pre-colonial dimension to it. It doesn't refer to the traditions of religious architecture. It's kind of, it's equally alien to all of us.
Yeah, yet familiar in a certain way. No, I mean, was there a sense that this is also in some ways not natural to India, but it fit well with the Indian ethos? Was there ever such an argument made about, I know Amartya Sen now talks about the argumentative Indian and so on as sort of ex post fact. There's a little bit of I have a sense in the book, a kind of a description of the Indian site and condition and history and trajectory that, in a sense, although this was an idea that was kind of fabricated and manufactured and put into place and sort of transformed into the state by Nehru, was it also in a certain way considered to be a sublation of the Indian history in some way?
That's an interesting question, because I mean, I think that, in some ways, certainly that was what was said. And that's, part of the story nations tell themselves, that they say we're doing something that we're anyway accustomed to or habituated to doing. This is in our way of life, in a way.
Yeah.
Whether it's toleration or the view of diversity as something that's a strength rather than a weakness. And I mean, I think that to me, at the end of the day, it's a question of whether those thoughts can get sort of translated into institutional forms, into laws, into things that are guarantees rather than the sort of privileges or tastes of culture. And I think that was the crucial move that occurs in the mid 20th century with Nehru and his generation. That how can you take something that Gandhi celebrated as part of India's rich heritage, Tagore thought was also part of the cultural past. Fine, that may be so, but you've got to find a way to actually enact it and give it teeth and edge and force under modern conditions. And I think that was the crucial work that gets done through this period from the mid 40s to the into the 60s, of translating ideas and sentiments into institutions and laws. And in a sense, I think we have not built on that foundation, because we've also accepted this story. But anyway, we're a tolerant bunch. We like diversity. It's all it's all kind of in the blood, which actually it's not. It's hard work.
It's hard work.
And it's hard work designing, and it's hard work keeping the building maintained in the way it's supposed to be. And I think there we've tended to believe our own myths too much. And part of the problem is that precisely laws, legal structures, rights decay if they're not constantly fought for and invigilated. And I think that's part of what we're seeing today. Yeah,
I mean, certainly there's a battle on for that. I mean, how to look at this? I mean, there's certainly, if you want, some kind of an attack, or certainly a siege, or a disclaiming of the Nehruvian state and even its institutions. And democracy is not a natural thing to, it is something to be defended. And at the same time, one could argue that this is exactly democracy at work, being questioned. A certain notion of Indianness is being put through the test, and precisely this is the kind of debate that one would have expected and anticipated. And so we have to go through it. So are both true, or either?
Well, absolutely, it is the case, as you're suggesting, that the definition of what is Indian or what is a national identity is something that is in debate. It's something that's not fixed in time. It's something that has to be, in a sense, reconsidered, revised across time. And I think that's part of what as I called it, the idea of India was about. That it was sort of saying the idea of India is commitment to the revisability of this idea, that it's not a fixed idea. It's not anchored in one identity, whether it's of religion or language or region or ethnicity or whatever it might be. It's a constant argument. And so in that sense, absolutely, the idea of India is an invitation to debate. I think the problem occurs when what's said is that, well, actually, the idea of India is this. It's rooted it's
Singular.
rooted, for instance, in this one culture. Or as the slogan of the manifesto of the BJP says, one nation, one culture, one people. And I think that's the attempt to kind of schematize it and simplify it is a problem. And one of the extraordinary things, and I think this is distinctive about what I call the idea of India, is its openness to complexity. That being a nation, keeping a nation together is a damned hard business. And it's not made easier by trying to impose one definition. So I think in that sense,
classic, when I try to explain the difference between secularism in the French or the American understanding and the Indian understanding, it's this distinction where sort of a high embrace of complexity, diversity, thought, debate, discussion is critical to the Indian case, whereas that's even in France today, the idea of a single culture is very strong, right, over there. Certainly, and is debated in the US.
I think that's right. There's a kind of there's a enamorment with simplicity and with clarity. These are the clear walls of separation. These are the clear. Whereas often these things are messy, and it does mean that you do need the laws and the rules, but you also need a very sophisticated and self-aware political citizenry and leadership to engage with them. So it's asking a lot of people.
Talking of which, how did you get into this whole business? You grew up all over the world, didn't you? You grew up in Africa and part a lot. Most of your education is the UK. So how did you get, if I may say, obsessed with this question?
As you say, I did grow up in different parts of the world, including for substantial part in India. And my initial work, my first book was actually about France, about French political theory. And the two things that I became interested in, one was, the way in which the ideas that, in a sense, were first articulated in Europe, in the West, in America, and Europe, ideas like the nation, like democracy, like revolution, like genocide, like ethnic cleansing, how these ideas actually traveled so rapidly and with such imaginative grip across the world. How the idea of the state or representative government and how they got taken up in other parts of the world and turned to different purposes. So, in India, of course, was one of the most extraordinary laboratories of this, of the adoption of other languages, other political languages, and their kind of repurposing for Indian uses. So, trying to figure out, as you mentioned, the way in which secularism gets taken up in India, or democracy or representative government. It has been for me a very interesting question to think about. And the other question, which I kind of also thought through in my work on French intellectuals, was how and why do very smart people change their ideas? One of the striking things in France, in post-Second World War France, was this very sharp change from a commitment to leftism and the idea of revolution and the whole kind of gauchiste movement of 1968 and so on. 10 years later, the French intellectual culture had completely transformed. It was much more on the right. It was anti-revolutionary. It had turned against the Soviet Union. It was looking for a kind of liberal basis to people. And so I was very interested in how does a sophisticated intellectual culture, in a sense, it's an anthropological question. How do ideas change? And why do they change? And in a sense, that's also something one is puzzling over in India today. How did a project Yes, I mean, how did a project that began with a very strong intellectual investment in what India could be, how has it been transformed into something at the moment that looks to be going in quite a different direction?
Is it just time? Think, for instance, of the infamous or famous Chandigarh furniture. It was made in the 50s, and because that was the cheapest way to furnish these buildings of state that were being built, and the universities and the offices, since it was a administrative city. But 50 years on, its furniture gets old and it starts breaking down. And people want new and different things. Some things become treasured heirlooms. Other things just get sort of put in the recycling heaps, and other people pick them up. Some to put them in their own museums in the West. You're talking about how things change, how ideas change, and how things move on.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, yeah, as I say, nothing that ages or dates itself more quickly than ideas of the future. In a sense, as you said, the furniture that was used in the offices and houses of Chandigarh and the different sectors and in the Secretariat and so on, it became part of this kind of bureaucratic miasma of Chandigarh. And, each of these pieces of furniture had their kind of inventory number written on, PWD, whatever it might be, Chandigarh, the government of.
It's all very Kafkaesque, isn't it? That whole
yeah. So each furniture had a kind of number and name, but it was also turned into kind of piece of bureaucracy, and I think what happened in the 1990s when liberalization began. Suddenly different kinds of materials became available in India: plastics, metals, shiny things, etc. And state governments now had more, but their budgets were increased because the economy was going. They had more tax revenue, etc. So this became let's get rid of the old. And let's get in all the new, the new furniture, the furniture of the future. And indeed, I remember
it
friends
wasn't
of mine,
just the furniture. Yeah, I mean, it was like the entire. So there's a whole cultural throwing out of old stuff. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
you're talking about your friends of yours. Yeah.
Well, the people who I knew who were buying up this furniture that was being thrown out. At the time, and it wasn't really valued. Even in West, in auction houses, it took a while to create a market for it because it was very different from Western modernist furniture, which was more kind of industrially produced and designed. A lot of this furniture was kind of hand put together by carpenters so there was a certain kind of handcrafted crudeness to it, which was actually very beautiful. But I think it took a while for galleries and auction houses in the West. It took a few years for them to see. Then suddenly it became very desirable because it was both modern, but also handmade in a way that, Eames furniture was not handmade. It was industrially produced.
Right.
And so what was, cleared out of the offices and so on in Chandigarh suddenly turned up in, Manhattan dining rooms, complete with the kind of 1950s green vinyl, but suddenly now that had a kind of cachet to it. So I think it was a particular moment when kind of new idea of the new was taking over in India, and of course
So you're blaming it on liberalization. You're saying that's it.
No, I'm not necessarily blaming on it because I mean that was, I think, the precondition of it. But I think also there was a sense, and this is the sadness of it, there wasn't a sense that this furniture was somehow integral to the architecture. It was somehow seen as kind of extraneous to, whereas in fact, with Jeanneret and others, it had been designed with great care and attention, and the scaling of it and all of that was for these rooms and spaces.
Is this lack of recognition also the lack of recognition of the? I'm jumping, extrapolating and taking aesthetic liberty here of the lack of recognition of the designedness of the Nehruvian state and its aspirations. I mean, does this all, or is it just furniture gets old, or is it a sort of a part of a whole disillusionment and misreading of the entire effort.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, in the and you have to say, I mentioned earlier that in the 1950s there was this attempt to kind of generate this public debate about these things.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that in the end, that was probably a debate amongst a very narrow group of people. I mean, a rather small group of people. So the wider meanings of the project perhaps didn't reach the people and groups that it needed to reach. So, in the case of Chandigarh, I mean, the Corbusier tapestries were preserved and so on, but
barely, yeah.
Yeah, barely. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
but it did require quite a lot of kind of, civic people to sort of activists kind of, push for this. But I think the furniture, it was never valued as part of, as I say, this integral whole, which was both an aesthetic choice, but also a functional thing. And you see this also in the way in which colonial era buildings are treated. There's a one doesn't want to be precious about this, but at the same time, there's a way in which the integrity of the buildings is not really very often respected.
Sure.
And of course, you need to put an air cooler somewhere, and so you jam it in the window because functionally you need it. But I think one of the problems is that architects in India have this whole business of how do you repurpose the existing fabric in a way that integrates it into contemporary use. There's not been very much of that. I mean, architects in India have wanted to set their mark new, to build something from the ground, scratch. But actually, the repurposing of existing buildings is a whole kind of architectural skill in itself.
Some of that is the Chandigarh example. Modern Indian profession was trained by the Chandigarh example, where you wanted to set the slate clean. By contrast, as you're saying, for instance, that was a more narrowly focused discussion. Although it did create a big impression in the public imagination. I think even because when you make architecture, you see it. It transmits from in other ways. But the sort of ethos of repurposing that you're talking about, recycling, reusing, your standard Indian city does that pretty well, doesn't it? I mean, recycling is an ethos, and indeed, in some ways, connects to the chairs. If we are using that as an allegory or a short vignette of this process. Mostly those chairs would get recycled and sold to the kabadis, and the kabadis recyclers would either try and resell it to the bastis or the poor people, or even if they couldn't, they would use it as firewood. So there is a culture of recycling, but maybe not in the formal architectural circles, which is much more influenced by the imperative of making something new.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, you're quite correct to say that, of course, this ethos of recycling and reusing is very much there, but not I think amongst those who were trained in the profession. And so I think with buildings, that was not something that was really thought about. And of course now, even you now need to think in terms of architectural conservation for Chandigarh itself. That itself is but if you look at much of, for example, Europe, in Italy, Germany, one of the things that is done very brilliantly is the use of old buildings for new purposes, whether it's offices or museums or in India. There's been too much. We've lost a lot of the architectural heritage already because there wasn't the imagination to see how these buildings could be made new again, how they could be sort of brought in. So, just knock it down and build something else. Sure. And in a sense, that's partly what's happening with the Central Vista thing now. So instead of thinking carefully and sensitively, well, how do you take what's existing and, re-energize it with new purposes? And how do you carefully and discreetly add to it? There's this sense of, well, let's build something new. Let's make it. It's a technocratic kind of conception, and rather than what I would think is a more properly.
Yeah, I mean, they're not just adding in; they're aligning up with a particular visual imperial aesthetic order, right? I mean, Rajpath has a imperial monumentality. I mean, you talk about this in your own book about how Lachins imagined it with a certain aim and the privileging of the viceroy's house. And even though, the new government, you remember Nehru famously turned down the governor's house in Chandigarh. He said, no, I don't want it over here. So by building these structures on Rajpath, aligning up with that axis, pushing back up again the viceroy's house, even though the prime minister doesn't sit in there, I think the whole effort is now to code into that imperial visual imagination. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, I think that I would agree with that, and in that sense, it's something of a step back, because I think one of the things that did happen, from the 50s, 60s, 70s onwards, was that this imperial space, as you described it, this imperial vista, was reappropriated by the citizenry. It was reappropriated. It was the place where you went, you got your quality ice creams, and you got your boat rides on the lake, and people hung out there in the evenings. You visit to India Gate. You had the museum, etc. So it was reappropriated as a much more public and, in some sense, democratic space. And the plan now is, of course, to insulate it and to securitize it in a way. In a way, exactly what happened to the Secretariat complex in Chandigarh. In the wake of the insurgencies of the 80s and so on. So in a way, this become, you're putting the center of Delhi into a state of permanent emergency, where the populace is excluded because the difficult and precious business of controlling the populace has to occur from that site.
That's right.
And this it's a profound kind of betrayal, I think, of the post-independence attempt to kind of make this into a people's domain.
That's right. Yeah. No, absolutely. And the Indian nation state moved into the imperial buildings, but through that process sought to repurpose them as more democratic institutions. And certainly, as they became the maidans for the public, with the quality ice cream and the pani puri and the chaat and so on and so forth, was also an appropriation of decidedly imperial architecture. And this then, so I see it. Yeah, it securitizes the space, and it does so by invoking a backward-looking image, key part of which exactly is editing out the modernist period.
Yeah, and it's done in the name of, this is what Indian democracy needs. No, it's what a conception of the Indian state believes it needs.
I mean, the functional problem can be solved in many ways. You need 10 million more square feet. I've got a few ideas which don't work this way.
Absolutely. And indeed, that's a kind of functional problem around which there needs to be some extended discussion and debate about. Let's have 2 or 3 options in terms of resolving the functional problem. Right. But that's not how it has gone.
One of the stories goes that it's the civil services in India. There is the political orders, and then there's the civil services, and then there is the whatever you want to call them, educated elite, the technocrats, the engineers, and the scientists, right? So the Nehruvian worldview was that hopefully the technocrats, the scientists and the architects and the engineers and the humanities people, lesser so, but also there, would play a central role in the modern Indian imagination. Yeah. That I would argue people like you and me and all the other IIT trained engineers who are in Silicon Valley, we were all supposed to be part of that middle ground of the making of the new Indian nation state. Yes. How would you place that? Is that you and I here, we are sitting and talking about this. So in a sense, we are still discussing this idea. We are continuing the responsibility of debating and discussing and securing the nation state. But at the same time, does it feel like that's an idea that lost out in history, that conception, that responsibility was not upheld and therefore ceded to other politics and other forces?
Yeah, again, I mean, it's a complicated question about the kind of relationship between ideas and practice, intellectuals and power, intellectuals and the state, and so on. And I certainly think that it's true that in the first decades of the Indian project, I mean, intellectuals who were part of that were very much sought, had an important role. And I think a couple of things have happened. One, I think the sort of professionalization of knowledge pushed intellectuals away from that kind of public engagement, but also that public responsibility, because, it can be pretty awkward being an intellectual engaged in public debate. And I think so in some senses, there was the emergence of kind of the academic domain and careers in the academic domain, both in India, but also abroad, took out some of that energy. But I think also there was a way in which the expansion of democracy, the emergence of, from the late 80s, early 90s, the emergence of new groups into politics, proliferated the range of voices in the political domain. And, voices that intellectuals were not necessarily particularly sensitive to or could hear very well, or indeed even wanted to hear. So in a sense, there was this up pressure, if you like, from some of the democratic processes, which brought different ideas to the fore, often, not in a fully articulated way, but where, and the existing intellectual elite couldn't really, in a sense, was sort of unable to really handle. And then there was also this withdrawal, and so it's interesting now, to think about why sort of the Indian liberal and left had a kind of intellectual sort of penumbra around it, but the right has not really had that, and so I think you're seeing a kind of double vacuum at the moment, where the liberal and left intellectuals have kind of vacated this space, or been made to vacate this space. But it's not as if the right.
No, they don't. Yeah. They don't. I mean,
so you've got a kind of absence of really, serious discussion about ideas. I mean, there's arguments about policy, about this, that, but the fundamental arguments are kind of, it's all taken as if, given. And I think, you see this in the realm of, for example, architecture, where major architectural decisions are taken, and they seem to be purely, in a sense, technocratic decisions, rather than looking at their political, aesthetic, social implications. I mean, if you think about over the last 20 years, what have been the two big forms in which public architecture has expressed itself in India? I mean, public architecture, publicly funded. And, one has been through this proliferation of statuary.
Particularly the Sardar Patel, yeah.
Wherever. I mean, every town you go, the public statue is a kind of architectural statement. It defines neighborhoods. Where the Ambedkar statue is, that's the Dalit neighborhood. So that's one. And the other, of course, is the whole Ram Mandir Ayodhya debate. There's been no architectural engagement with those. What do we think of those as problems for the built environment of India? and the kinds of choices they make. And in a sense, the Central Vista issue has kind of now brought back some discussion. But I think that there are a whole number of other areas where there could be a much richer debate if one is responding to what's actually happening,
Right.
rather than to some narrative of architectural history. But the other thing I think that's been very striking over the last 30 years since the liberalization is the way in which the state has in a sense withdrawn from trying to remake the landscape, except in terms of infrastructure. So highways, railway lines, ports, SEZs, that's the kind of domain of state public architecture. But Central Vista is one exception to that. And on the other hand, the private sector has been very busy, but that's created also it's invested in essentially private architecture, the IT parks, the gated communities, the apartment buildings that are kind of totally disjuncted from their neighborhood.
Right.
So, extremely visible, extremely present, but also in a curious way, totally abstracted from their environment.
Yeah, and the sort of privatization of even the new capitals that had to be built, or Telangana, the new capital, Amravati. Yes. I mean, I remember there was a discussion around how to do that.
This is also a moment when what are called, the tier 3 cities in India are booming and expanding. And so they need all kinds of not just communications infrastructure but civic infrastructure. And so in a sense, there's a huge architectural opportunity to rethink what that might mean in these kind of cities.
Yeah, currently it's dominated by the Asian Tiger example. I mean, the firms, particularly Singapore-based firms, seem to have a huge foothold on building out and adding to this. I mean, the amazing thing was, they're building these extensions around Chandigarh. I'm not talking about Panchkula and Mohali. I'm talking about these new proposed extensions. Right. And they hired a bunch of Singapore-based Indian version, local representatives of Singapore firms, pasting your standard plan into the spaces around Chandigarh without even any cognizance of, what's right next door.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real case of, if you give me a hammer, everything will look like a nail.
Sure.
And that's right. I mean, these are these big engineering construction companies.
Yeah.
They have about 6 templates for buildings.
Sure.
And wherever you are, we'll put it up.
We'll put it up. No problem. Yeah. And the more you use the standard design, the cheaper it is for you. Are things changing? I mean, emergence of a strong discourse. How are you? Can you tell us a little bit about Ashoka and what you're doing there? I mean,
yeah. Well, I mean, part of the reason for my kind of engaging with it is because I think it's a really important moment in India to be able to create and maintain some of these spaces for critical thinking in the humanities and the social sciences and the arts.
Yes.
And Ashoka is in that sense a real experiment in a liberal arts university. There've been one or two others which are now coming up, which is a good thing. In the south, there's one called Kriya, which has been started, and a few other small ones. So I hope that there will be a kind of example effect. And it's a very problematic moment right now for all kinds of education in India, but also higher education, where increasingly there's an attempt to control and to, particularly in the more critical forms of knowledge, there's an attempt to kind of downplay them and control them in favor of promoting what is seen as the purely technical disciplines. And of course that's a kind of disastrous way of proceeding, because as we know, I mean, if you want to be a society that produces knowledge, you have to kind of value pure theory as well.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
that's what produces the usefulness of useless knowledge is something you cannot predict.
Which India is well familiar with. We've had a long tradition of idle speculation.
Right, which
Yeah,
then produces and leads to certain kinds of skills and so I think this is something that needs to be promoted and defended in India. And one of the things that has really struck me is the I mean, we know this, but the sheer intelligence and passion and energy of students in India. And a sense that ideas matter in a way that sometimes to a kind of callow 18-year-old in the West, they don't. They're going to college because that's what you do. You go to college. Whereas I think there is a way in which these ideas matter. Now, I mean, on the specific question of architecture and that, as you say, there's been this proliferation, this huge expansion of schools and training in architecture. I mean, you would know more about this than I do, but unfortunately, I don't see that it's producing a kind of renaissance in imaginative thought and experimentation.
Not at all. No, it's a disaster. There are like 160. We had 20 schools of architecture when I graduated, I think. There are over 160 schools of architecture with almost no faculty. And they're all, technocratic degrees, basically. Not all, 95% or plus. There isn't a single history of architecture program in the country. Nobody teaches history theory, like all the questions that we are talking about in terms of the relationship between, architecture and civil society or philosophy or whatever. There isn't a single history theory program in the country. No PhD granting.
Gosh, that's really stunning, actually.
It's stunning.
Coming back to the sense where we started, architecture is far too important to be left simply to the architects. It needs to be kind of there and integrated into the broader discussion and so on. I mean, because it's seen as this kind of something that's somehow distinct from and separate from the other arts and humanities and social sciences. Whereas the great attraction of architecture is that it's a way of integrating both the sciences and aesthetics and social purpose and moral vision. And I think if only architecture could rediscover that sort of huge ambition that is its original impulse.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time out to record this great conversation with me. I have learned a lot. Thanks for taking the time, Sunil.
Thanks so much, Vikram. It was a real pleasure. And I look forward to more conversations.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.